Hello, my name is Annette and I'm an Erasmus student from Germany and currently studying at the University Pablo de Olavide in Sevilla, Spain. This is the second activity, the book club, for the lecture Introduction to Sociology, which was held by Dr. Maria José del Pino Espejo. And today I will read the first chapter of Judith Butler's book, Undoing Gender. I finally talk about an author, to be clear, an American philosopher who is still alive. Her name is Judith Butler, and she was born on the 24th of February 1956. So now she is 66 years old, and she was born in Cleveland, Ohio. Her educational path begins at the Bennington College. Afterwards, she studied philosophy at Yale University, where she received her bachelor's, her master's, and her PhD. In the following years, she worked as a teacher at the Wesleyan University, George Washington University, and Johns Hopkins University. At the Berkeley University in California, she was appointed Maxine Ayotte Professor of Rhetoric and Comparative Literature. You might be wondering why I choose Butler. Well, she is the woman who developed the concept gender performativity, a new way of thinking about the self, gender, and desire. She first develops it in her book Gender Trouble from 1990. Later, in 1993, she publishes Bodies That Matter, and in 2004, Undoing Gender, in order to deepen and explain her concept. The process of thinking about gender goes back to the feminism and the discussion about the equality between men and women. Therefore, the idea of a sex gender division was invented, where sex is understood as the biological body and gender is understood as cultural expectations and meanings of that sexed body. This resulted in the assumption that the differences between men and women resulted from social structures which could be changed. The famous quote which underlines this is from Simone de Beauvoir: "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." Butler picked up this idea but pushed it further actually. In her understanding, gender is entirely created through performance, and this produces the identity. She explains that performative acts like signs and action create gender itself. This happens through ritualized repetition, which gives gender its illusion of stability. So, because gender is repeated and performed, there is a possibility to perform differently. In the same way, she thinks about sex. Sex is a part of a regulatory practice that produces the bodies it governs through performative acts. In connection to that, she points out that in gendered and heterosexist cultures, the body must be sexed in order to be culturally intelligible. To round it up, it's important to understand what Butler's understanding of performativity is. For her, it is both bodily and linguistic. For example, if a doctor says, "It's a girl," the speech act inscribes gender onto the infant. Actually, in the act of performing the conventions of reality, by embodying those fiction in our actions, we make those artificial conventions appear to be natural and necessary. Let's face her book Undoing Gender from 2004, which can be seen as an ethical text. With this book, she opens up a conceptual space to think about the relationship between social and genders and human viability. She explores how the linked process of sexing and gendering are required being viable subjects. Therefore, Butler theorizes the problem of gender explicitity in the term of recognition and desire. To make her points, more clear, she explains how respected and respectable medical institutions apply the regulatory norms of sex to manipulate baby's body on the case of David Rhyme, an American intersex child. With her work, she wants to raise the profiles of those who suffer the violent quietude of normality. Butler especially aims to account for transsexual, transgender, and intersex experiences. Additionally, she addresses the tensions between feminist, queer, trans theories in order to argue that feminism must ally itself with other movements. Moreover, the book Undoing Gender is a framework to think through social problems, and therefore it is really valuable for critical theory. By reading along, you will recognize that her text is structured in questions. By this, she is asserting that continual questioning it is itself a feminism act. So let's start reading. Beside oneself on the limits of sexual autonomy. What makes for a livable world is no idle question. It's not merely a question of philosophers. It is possessed in various idioms, all at the time by people in various walks of life. If that makes them all philosophers, then that is a conclusion I am happy to embrace. It becomes a question for ethics. I think not only when we ask personal questions, what makes my own life bearable, but when we ask from a position of power and from the point of view of distributive justice, what ought to make the lives of others bearable. Somewhere in their answer, we find ourselves not only committed to a certain view of what life is and what it should be, but also of what constitutes the human, the distinctively human life, and what does not. There is always a risk of anthropocentrism if one assumes that the distinctively human life is valuable or most valuable or is the only way to think the problem of value. But perhaps to counter that tendency, it is necessary to ask both the question of life and the question of the human and not to let them fully collapse into one another. I would like to start and end with the question of the human, of who counts as human, and the related questions of whose lives count as lives, and with a question that has preoccupied many of us for years: what makes for a grievable life? Butler introduces her chapter with the question: what makes for a livable world to us and to others? With that said, she frames the key question of sociology. What society do we live in? Then she enlarges upon the two questions: who counts as a human and whose life counts as lives? The first question occurs especially in the debates about abortion, when it is discussed since when the unborn counts as a human being. There is a dispute about whether it is already a human being from the beginning of the pregnancy or only after the 23rd week. The second question comes up, for example, in discussions about the disabled persons. Those answers of this question form our society. In relation to that, the perspective of life sociology is interesting. Sociology of life is a subfield of sociology and therefore does not understand life and thinking in a dualized way. Primarily, they elaborating how thinking arises from life and how life can be made the object of thought. For Butler, we live in a binary world and therefore think, speak, and act in a binary way. Relevant to this, Lakoff once said, the language we use shapes what our minds are drawn to. I believe that whatever differences exist within the international gay and lesbian community, and there are many, we all have some notions of it is to have lost somebody. And if we've lost, then it seems to follow that we have had, that we have desired and loved and struggled to find the conditions for our desire. We have all lost someone in recent decades from AIDS, but there are other losses that inflict us other diseases. Moreover, we are as a community subjected to violence, even if some of us individually have not been. And this means that we are constituted politically in part by virtue of the social vulnerability of our bodies. We are constituted as fields of desire and physical vulnerability, at once policy assertive and vulnerable. In this part, Butler analyzes the current society in which we live in. Like I said, for Butler, we live in a binary world. She speaks of the heterosexual matrix, which link cultural norms of sex, gender, and sexuality. This means culture compels us to take a sex as a biological given, male or female. Upon this, culture builds a stable gender, masculinity or femininity, which then determines your desire towards the opposite sex mostly. But for Butler, not any of these connections follow from each other. Sex, gender, and desire need not to conform to binary structures. Let's continue reading. I'm not sure I know when mourning is successful or when one has fully mourned another human being. I'm certain, though, that it does not mean that one has forgotten the person or that something else comes along to take his or her place. I don't think it works that way. I think instead that one mourns when one accepts the fact that the loss one undergoes will be one that changes your possibility forever, and that mourning has to do with agreeing to undergo the transformation, the full result of which you cannot know in advance. So there's losing and there's the transformative effect of loss, and this latter cannot be charted or planned. I don't think, for instance, you can invoke a Protestant ethic when it comes to loss. You can't say, oh, I'll go through loss this way and that I'll be the result and I'll apply myself to the task and I'll endeavor to achieve the resolutions of grief that is before me. I think one is hit by waves and that one starts out the day with an aim and project a plan and one finds oneself foiled. One finds oneself fallen and is exhausted but does not know why something is larger than one's own deliberate plan or project, larger than one's own knowing. Something takes hold, but is in this something coming from the self, from the outside, or from some region where the difference between the two is indeterminable? What is it that claims us to such moments, such that we are not the masters of ourselves? To what are we tied, and by what are we sized? It may seem that one is undergoing something temporary, but it could be that in its experience something about who we are is revealed, something that delineates the ties we have to others, that shows us that those ties constitute a sense of self, compose who we are, and that when we lost them, we lose our composure in some fundamental sense. We do not know who we are or what we do. Many people think that grief is privatizing, that it returns us to a solitary situation, but I think it exposes the constitutive sociality of the self, a basis of thinking, a political community of a complex order. It is not just that I might be said to I have these relations, or that I might be set back and view them at the distance, enumerating them, explaining what the friendship means, what that lover meant or means to me. On the contrary, grief displays the way in which we are in order to thrill of our relations with others that we cannot always recount or explain, that often interrupts the self conscious account of ourselves we might try to provide in all ways that challenge the very notion of ourselves as autonomous and in control. I might try to tell a story about what I am feeling, but it would have to be a story in which the very I who seeks to tell the story is stopped in the midst of the telling. The very I is called into question by its relation to the one to whom I address myself. This relation to the other does not precisely ruin my story or reduce me to speechlessness, but it does invariably clutter my speech with signs of its undoing. Let's face it, we're undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something. If this seems so clearly the case with grief, it is only because it was already the case with desire. One does not always stay intact. It may be that one wants to or does, but it may also be that despite one's best efforts, one is undone in the face of the other, by the touch, by the scent, by the feel, by the prospect of the touch, by the memory of the feel. And so, when we speak about my sexuality or my gender as we do, and we must, we mean something complicated by it. Neither of these are precisely a possession, but both are to be understood as modes of being dispossessed, ways of being for another, or indeed by virtue of another. It does not suffice to say that I am promoting a rational view of the self over an autonomous one, or trying to describe autonomy in terms of relationality. The term relationality sutters the rupture in the relation we seek to describe, a rupture that is constitutive of identify itself. This means that we will have to approach the problem of conceptualizing this possession with circumspection. One way of doing this is through the notion of ecstasy. We tend to narrate the history of border movement for sex freedom in such a way that ecstasy figures in the 90s and 70s and persists midway through the 80s. But maybe ecstasy is more historically persistent than that. Maybe it is with us all along. To be aesthetic means literally to be outside oneself, and this can have several meanings. To be transported beyond oneself by a passion, but also to be beside oneself with rage or grief. I think that if I can still speak to we and include myself within its terms, I can speak to those of us who are living a certain way beside ourselves, whether it is in sexual passion or emotional grief or political rage. In a sense, their predicament is to understand what kind of community is composed of those who are besides themselves. I want to stop and think. When we read the sentence, we are undone by each other. It shows how deeply affected we are by each other. But what means undone? A person can come undone, meaning that they have lost their composure for self-control. It can also mean to be without hope for the future or having experienced great disappointment. To make it clear, I would like to point out the outing of an LGBTQI person. First of all, outings can be really challenging for both the trans person, for example, and their environment. Their relatives often have solid understanding of a person's role and therefore it feels like a loss for them. But those who are affected are also under enormous pressure and sometimes even depression because they are living besides themselves, like Butler say. So let's continue reading. We have an interesting political predicament since most of the time when we hear about rights, we understand them as pertaining to individuals. Or when we argue for protection against discrimination, we argue as a group or a class. And in that language and in that context, we have to present ourselves as bounded beings, distinct, recognizable, delineated subjects before the law, a community defined by sameness. Indeed, we had better be able to use that language to secure legal protection and entitlements. But perhaps we make a mistake if we take a definition of who we are legally to be adequate description of what we are about. Although this language might well establish our legitimacy with a legal framework and scound a liberal versions of human ontology, it fails to do justice to passion and grief and rage, all of which tear us from ourselves, bind us to others, transport us, undo us, and implicate us in lives that are not our own, sometimes fatally irreversible. It is not easy to understand how political community is wrought from such ties. One seeks and one speaks for another, to another, and yet there is no way to collapse the distinction between other and myself. When we say we do nothing more than designate this as very problematic. We do not solve it, and perhaps it is ought to be insoluble. We ask that the state, for instance, keep its laws of our bodies, and we call for principles of bodily self-defense and bodily integrity to be accepted as political goods. Yet it is through the body that gender and sexuality become exposed to others, implicated in social processes, inscribed by cultural norms, and apprehended in their social meanings. In a sense, to be a body is to be given over to others, even as a body is, empathically one's own, that over which we must claim rights of autonomy. This is true for the claims made by lesbian, gays, and bisexuals in favor of sexual freedom as it is for transsexual and transgender claims to self-determination, as it is for intersex claims to be free of coerced medical, surgical, and psychiatric interventions, as it is for the claims to be free from racist attacks, physical and verbal, and it is for the feminist claim to reproductive freedom. It is difficult, if it not impossible, to make these claims without resource of autonomy, and specifically a sense of bodily autonomy. Bodily autonomy, however, is a lively paradox. I am not suggesting, though, that we have choice to make these claims. We must, and I am not saying that we have to make these claims reluctantly or strategically. They are part of our normative aspiration of any movement that seeks to maximize the protection and the freedoms of sexual and gender minorities, of women defined with the broadest possible compass, of racial and ethnic minorities, especially as they cut across all the other categories. But is there another normative aspiration that we must also seek to articulate and to defend? Is the way in which the place of the body in all of these struggles opens up a different conception of politics? The body implies morality, vulnerability, agency. The skin and the flesh exposes us to the clays of others, but also to touch and to violence. The body can be an agency, an instrument of all these as well, or the side where doing and being done become equivocal. Although we struggle for rights over our own bodies, the very bodies for which we struggle are not quite ever only our own. The body has its invariably public dimension, constituted as a social phenomenon in the public sphere. My body is and is not mine. Given over from the start to the world of others, bearing the imprint formed within the crucible of social life, the body is only later and with some uncertainty that to which I lay claim as my own. Indeed, if I seek to deny the fact that my body relates me against my will and from the start to others, I do not choose to have in proximity to myself. The subway or the tube are excellent examples of this dimension of sociality. And if I build a notion of autonomy and on the basis of the denial of the sphere or primary unwilled physical proximity with others, then I do precisely deny the social and political conditions of my embodiment. In the name of autonomy. If I'm struggling for autonomy, do I not need to be struggling for something else as well, a conception of myself as invariably in community impressed upon by others, impressing them as well, and in the ways that are not always clearly delineable, in forms that are not fully predictable? Is there a way that we might struggle for autonomy in many spheres, but also consider the demands that are imposed upon us by living in a world of being who are, by definition, physically dependent on one another, physically vulnerable to one another? Is this not another way of imagining community in such a way that it becomes incumbent upon us to consider very carefully when and where we engage violence, for violence is always an exploitation of that primary tie, that primary way in which we are, as bodies outside ourselves, for one another. If we might then return to the problem of grief, to the moments in which one undergoes something outside of one's control and finds one it is besides oneself, not at one with oneself, we can say grief contains within its possibility of apprehending the fundamental sociality of embodied life. The ways in which we are from the start, and by virtue of being a bodily being, already given over beyond ourselves, implicated in lives that are not our own. Can this situation, one that is so traumatic for sexual minorities, one that establishes a very specific political perspective for anyone who works in the field of sexual and gender politics, supply a perspective with which to begin to apprehend to the contemporary global situation? Mourning, fear, anxiety, rage. In the United States, after September 11, 2001, we have been everywhere, surrounded with violence, of having prepared it, having suffered it, living in fear of it, planning more of it. Violence is surely a touch of the worst order, a way in which the human vulnerability to other humans is exposed in its most terrifying way, a way in which we are given over without control, to the will of another, the way in which life itself can be expunged by the willful action of another. To the extent that we commit violence, we are acting upon another, putting out others at risk, causing damage to others. In a way, we all live with this particular vulnerability, a vulnerability to the other that is part of the bodily life. But this vulnerability becomes highly exacerbated under certain social and political conditions. Although the dominant mode in the United States has been to shore up sovereignty and security, and to minimize or indeed foreclose this vulnerability, it can serve another function and another ideal. The fact that our lives are dependent on others can become basis of claims for non-militaristic political solutions, one which we cannot will always and which we must intend to even abide by as we begin to think about what politics might be implied by staying with the thought of corporeal vulnerability itself. Is there something to be gained from grieving, from tarrying with grief, remaining exposed to its apparent tolerability, and not endeavoring to seek a resolution for grief through violence? Is there something to be gained in the political domain by maintaining grief as part of the framework by which we think our international ties? If we say with the sense of the loss, we are left feeling only passive and powerless as some fear, or are we rather returned to a sense of human vulnerability, to our collective responsibility for the physical life of one another? The attempt to foreclose that vulnerability, to banish it, to make ourselves secure at the expense every other human consideration is surely also to eradicate one of the most important resources from which we must take our bearings and find our way. To grieve and to make grief itself into a resource of politics, it is not to be resigned, not a simple passivity or powerlessness. It is rather to allow oneself to extrapolate from this experience of vulnerability to the vulnerability that others suffer through military incursions, occupations, suddenly declared wars, and police brutality. That our very survival can be determined by those who do not know and over whom is not final control means that life is precarious, and that politics must consider what forms of social and politic organization seeks best to sustain precarious lives across the globe. There is a more general conception of the human at work here, one in which we are from the start given over to the other, one in which we are from the start, even prior to individuation itself, and by virtue of our embodiment, given over to another. This makes us vulnerable to violence, but also to another range of touch, a range that includes a eradication of our being at the one end and the physical support for our lives at the other. We cannot endeavor to recertify the situation, and we cannot recover the source of this vulnerability, for it precedes the formation of I. This condition of being laid bare from the start depend on those do not know is one with which we cannot precisely argue. We come into the world unknowing and dependent, and to a certain degree we remain that way. We can try from a point of view of autonomy to argue with the situation, but we are perhaps foolish, if not dangerous, when we do. Of course, we can say that for some of this, primary scene is extraordinary, loving, and reciprocative, a warm tissue of relation that support and nurture nutritious life in its infancy. For others, this is, however, a scene of abandonment or violence or starvation. Their bodies given over and to nothing or to a brutality or not a sustenance. No matter what a valence of that scene is, however, the fact remains that infancy constitutes a necessary dependency on that we never fully leave behind. Body still must be apprehended as given over, part of understanding the oppression of lives precisely to understand that there is no way to argue away the condition of primary vulnerability, of being given over to the touch of the other, even if, or precisely when, there is no other there and no support for our lives. To counter oppressions requires that one understand that lives are supported and maintained differently, that there are radically different ways in which human physically vulnerability is distributed across the globe. Certain lives will be highly protected, and the abrogation of their claims to sanctity will be sufficient to mobilize the force of war, and other lives will not find such fast and furious support and will not even qualify as grievable. Let's stop here. In the last couple pages, you can recognize an interesting shift, a move from a theory of gender performativity to a consideration of precarious lives, the theory of precarity. Therefore, the body and the political desire for a radical equality makes both theories interrelated. Precarity is about a singular performing bodies and about the conditions in which lives become possible. Performativity, on the other hand, is what we do or might do not when we are doing gender. Therefore, the main goal of the performativity theory was to refashion our imagination about the limits of the human, but there was one essential point missing in the explanation about the notion of human and life. With that, we have to keep in mind that the idea of the human is too tight for some bodies to perform because they do not conform the norms which prescribe what counts as a proper human. For Butler, the term human means nothing else but a norm according to which differential distribution of humanness can and does take place. The term life, on the other hand, describes a condition, what makes a life that is possible. With that, the two theories intercept each other when life of a singular performative body shows itself as completely entangled with the conditions and that it is with a livable world. In the end, performativity foregrounds that norms generate inequalities, and precarity foregrounds the necessity to change such norms. Another thing what I want to point out is the sentence, the body is and is not mine. This sentence displays the contest ownership over body. This introduces precarity into performativity. Bodies perform the reality in order to live, but this means there will be bodies who are part of this reality and there will be bodies which are not part of this reality. The problem here is those bodies who are not part of the produced and repeated reality do not count. They do not fit into the established meaning of what is human. This makes the lives these bodies life precarious. In the end, the lack of possibilities exposes lives to precarity. Let's continue reading. So, what are the cultural contours of the notion of the human at work here? And how do the contours that we accept as the cultural frame for the human limit the extent to which we can avow loss as us? This is surely a question that lesbian, gay, and bi studies has asked in relation to violence against sexual minorities, and that transgendered people have asked as they have been singled out from their harassment and sometimes murder, and that intersex people have asked whose formative years have so often been marked by an unwanted violence against their bodies, in the same name of a normative notion of human morphology. This is no doubt as well the basis of a profound affinity between movements centered on gender and sexuality, with efforts to counter the normative human morphologies and capacities that condemn or efface those who are physically challenged. It must as well also be part of the affinity with anti-racist struggles, given the racial differential that there undergirds the culturally viable notion of human, one that we see acted out in a dramatic and terrifying ways in the global arena at the present time. So, what is the relation between violence and what is unreal? Between violence and unreality? What that attends to those who became the victims of violence? And where does the notion of the ungrievable life come in? On the level of discourse, certain lives are not considered lives at all. They cannot be humanized. They fit no dominant frame for the human, and their dehumanized occurs first at this level. This level then gives the rise to a physical violence. Then it some sense delivers the message of dehumanization, which is already at work in the culture. So it is not just that the discourse exists in which there is no frame and no story, no name for such a life, or that violence might be said to realize or apply this discourse. Violence against those who are already not quite lives, who are living in a state of suspension between life and death, leaves a mark that is not a mark. If there is a discourse, it is a silent and melancholic writing in which there have been no lives and no losses. There has been no common physical condition, no vulnerability that serves as the basis of an apprehension of our commonality, and there has been no surrendering of the commonality. None of this takes place on the order of the event. None of this takes place. How many lives have been lost from AIDS in Africa in the last few years? Where are the media representations of this loss? This discursive elaboration of what these losses mean for communities there? I began this chapter with suggesting that perhaps the interrelated movements and modes of inquiry that collect here might need to consider autonomy as one dimension of their normative aspirations, one value to realize when we ask ourselves in what direction ought we to proceed and what kinds of values ought we to be realizing. I suggest as well that the way in which the body figures in gender and sexuality studies. I suggest, I'm sorry, as well that the way in which the body figures in gender and sexuality studies and in their struggles for the less oppressive social world, for their otherwise gendered and for sexual minorities of all kinds, is precisely to underscore the value of being beside oneself, of being a prowess boundary given over to others, finding oneself in a trajectory of desire, in which one is taken out of oneself and situated irreversibly in a field of others in which one is not the presumptive center. The particular sociality that belongs to bodily life, to sexual life, and to becoming gendered, which is always, to a certain extent, becoming gendered for others, establishes a field of ethical enmeshment with others and a sense of disorientation for the first person, that is, perspective of the ego. As bodies, as we are always for something more than and another than ourselves. To articulate this as an entitlement is not always easy, but perhaps not possible. I suggest, for instance, that association is not luxury, but one of the very condition and prerogatives of freedom. Indeed, the kinds of associations we maintain, importantly, take many forms. It will not do to extol the marriage norms as the new idol for this movement, as the Human Rights Campaign has erroneously done. No doubt, marriage and same sex domestic partnership should certainly be available as option, but to install either as a model for sexual legitimacy is precisely to constrain the sociality of the body in acceptable ways. In light of seriously damaging judicial decisions against second part adoption in recent years, it is crucial to expand our notions of kinship beyond their heterosexual frame. It could be a mistake, however, to reduce kinship to family or to assume that all sustaining community and friendship ties are extrapolations of kind relations. Let's stop here and think about what we read. In the follow part, she makes her post-structural position clear. In general, post-structuralism is about the uncertainty of knowledge and the thinking that truth is not a fixed concept but rather a position in the world which is constantly changing based on your culture, politics, sociality, and economy. Therefore, the central question for post-structuralists pose in their work is how knowledge becomes possible at any particular time under specific historical conditions. One of the most influential figures of this movement is Michel Foucault. He analyzed the modern institutions, control and monitors the social population. Particularly, the role of discourse is central in his thinking of power. The term discourse describes the ways of talking and thinking about particular subjects that are united by common assumptions. Beyond that, power works through discourse. Discourses can be used to restrict alternative ways of thinking or speaking. At the same time, knowledge becomes a force to control this, because of the fact that expert discourses are established through power or authority. They can just be countered by competing expert discourses. As we can see, Butler picks up Foucault's concept of discourse, power in relation to modern organizational systems, and draws on her theory. Let's go back to the book and read along. I make an argument in Is Kindship Always Already Heterosexual in this volume that kindship ties that bind persons to one another may well be no more or less than an intensification of community ties, may or may not be based on their enduring or exclusive sexual relations, may well consist of ex-lovers, non-lovers, friends, and community members. The relation of kindship crossed the boundaries between community and family and sometimes redefine the meaning of friendship as well. When these modes of intimate association produce sustaining webs of relationship, they constitute a breakdown, a traditional kindship that displaces the presumption that biological and sexual relations structure kindship certainly. In addition, the incest taboo that governs kindship ties, producing unnecessary exogamy, does not necessarily operate among friends in the same way, or for that matter in networks of communities within these frames. Sexuality is no longer exclusively regulated by the rules of kindship at the same time that the durable tie can be situated outside the conjugal frame. Sexuality becomes open to a number of social articulations that do not always imply binding relations or contractual ties. That not all of our relations last or are meant to, however, does not mean that we are immune to grief. And the contrary, sexuality outside the field of monogamy well may open us to a different sense of community, intensifying the question of where on finds enduring ties, and so become the condition for an attunement to losses that exceed the directly private realm. Nevertheless, those who live outside the conjugal frame or maintain modes of social organization for sexuality that are neither monogamous nor quasi-material are more and more considered unreal, and their loves and losses less than true loves and true losses. The realization of this domain of human intimacy and sociality works by denying reality and truth to the relation it issues. The question of who and what is considered real and true is apparently a question of knowledge, but this is also, as Michael Foucault makes plain, a question of power. Having or bearing truth and reality is an enormously powerful prerogative. Within the social world, one way that power dissimulates is ontology. According to Foucault, one of the first tasks of the radical critique is to discern the relationship between mechanism of coercion and elements of knowledge. Here we are confronted with the limits of what the knowable limits that exercise a certain force but are not grounded in any necessity, limits that can only be treated or interrogated by raising a certain security through departing from an established ontology. Nothing can exist as an element of knowledge. If on the one hand it does not conform to a set of rules and constraints, characteristics, for example, of a given type of scientific discourse in a given period, and if, on the other hand, it does not possess the effects of coercion or simply the incentives peculiar to what is scientifically validated or simply rational or simply generally accepted, etc. Knowledge and power are not finally separable, but work together as establish a set of subtle and explicit criteria for thinking the world. It is there not a matter of describing what knowledge is and what power is, it is how one would repress the other or how the other would abuse the one, but rather a nexus of knowledge power has to be described, so what we can grasp what constitutes the acceptability of a system. What this means is that one looks both of the conditions by which the object field is constituted and for the limits of those constitutions. The limits are to be found where the reproducibility of the condition is not secure, the side where conditions are contingent, transformable. In Foucault's terms, schematically speaking, we have perpetual mobility, essential fragility, or rather the complex interplay between what replicates the same process and what transforms it. To intervene, the name of transformation means precisely to disrupt what has become settled, knowledge and knowable reality, and to use, as it were, one's unreality to make an otherwise impossible or illegible claim. I think that when we lays claim to reality or enters into its domain, something other than simple assimilations into prevailing norms can and does take place. The norms themselves can become rattle display the instability and become open to resignification. Let's stop here, and I want to focus on the universal human phenomenon kindship, which makes a huge part on the anthropologists as well as the sociological studies. The kindship theory studies the kindship rules and focuses on the question how society works. Kindship is defined as an individual social relationship to others. Therefore, you can separate three types of kindship. First, there is a consanguinity, which is kindship established by blood. Then there is affinity, which is kindship by marriage. And lastly, there is a fictive kind, which is established by, for example, adoption. Kindship rules are specific rules which can govern an individual descent, inheritance, marriage options, obligations, roles, socially appropriate sexual relations, and status. Consequently, kindship takes highly variable cultural forms and is one of the primary institutional and organizational principles of society. Butler's critique of kindship draws on her theories of subjection and picks up Foucault's theory again as we see it. Let's go back to the reading. In recent years, the new gender politics has offered numerous challenges from transgendered and transsexual peoples to established feminist and lesbian gay frameworks, and the intersex movement has rendered more complex the contents and demands of sexual rights advocates. If some of the left thought that these concerns were not properly or sustainably political, they have been under pressure to rethink the political sphere in terms of its gendered and sexual perceptions. The suggestion that butch, femme, and transgender lives are not essential reference for a refashioning of a political life and for a more just and equitable society faced to acknowledge the violence that the otherwise gendered suffer in the politic world and fails as well to recognize that embodiment denotes a constant set of norms governing who will count a viable subject within the sphere of politics. Indeed, if we consider that human bodies are not experienced without recourse to some ideality, some frame for experience itself, and that it is a true for experience of one's own body as it is for experiencing another. And if we accept that the ideality and frame are socially articulated, we can see how embodiment is not thinkable without the relation to a norm or a set of norms. The struggle to rework the norms by which bodies are experienced is thus crucial not only to disability politics but to the intersex and transgender movement as they contest forcibly imposed ideals of what bodies ought to be like. The embodied relation to the norm exercises a transformative potential to posit possibilities beyond the norms, or indeed a different future for the norm itself, is part of the work of fantasy. When we understand fantasy as taking the body as a point of departure for an articulation, then it is not always constrained by the body as it is. If we accept that altering these norms that decide normative human morphology give differential reality to different kinds of human as a result, then we actual impact on political life at its most fundamental level. That is, who counts as a human and what norms govern the appearance of real humanness. Moreover, fantasy is a part of the articulation of the possible. It moves us beyond what is merely actual and present into a realm of the possibility, the not yet actualized or the not actualizable. The struggle is to survive is not really separable from the cultural life of fantasy and to foreclosure of fantasy through censorship, degradation, or other means is one strategy for providing for the social death of persons. Fantasy is not the opposite of reality, it is what reality forecloses, and as a result, it defines the limits of reality. Constituting it is a constitutive outside. The critical promise of fantasy when we wear it and where it exists, it is to challenge the contingent limits of what will and will not be called reality. Fantasy is what allows us to imagine ourselves and others otherwise. It establishes the possible and the in excesses of the real. It points elsewhere, and when it is embodied, it brings the elsewhere home. How do drag but femme, transgender, transsexual persons enter into the political field? They make us not only question what is real and what must be, but they also show us how the norms that govern contemporary notions of reality can be questioned and how new modes of reality can become instituted. These practices of instituting new modes of reality take place in part through the scene of embodiment, where the body is not understood as a static and accomplished fact, but as an aging process, a mode of becoming that in becoming otherwise, exceeds the norms, reworks the norms, and make us see how realities to which we thought we were confined are not written in stone. Some people have asked me what is the use of increasing possibilities for gender. I tend to answer, possibility is not a luxury, it is as crucial as bread. I think we should not underestimate what the thought of the possible does for those whom the very issue of survival is most urgent. If we answer to the question, is life possible? Is yes, that is surely something significant. It cannot, however, be taken for granted as the answer. That is a question whose answer is sometimes no, or one that has not ready answer, or one that breaks an opening agnostic. journaling. For many who can do and answer the question in affirmative, that answer is hard won, if won at all, in an accomplishment that is fundamentally conditioned by reality, being structured or restructured in such a way that the affirmation becomes possible. One of the central tasks of lesbian and gay international right is to assert in clear and public terms the reality of homosexuality, not as an inner truth, not as a sexual practice, but as one of the defining features of the social world in its very intelligibility. In other words, it is one thing to assert the reality of lesbian and gay lives as a reality and to insist that these are lives worthy of protection in their specificity and commonality, but it is quite another to insist that the very public assertion of gayness calls into question what counts as reality and what counts as a human life. Indeed, the task of international lesbian and gay politics is no less than a remarking of reality, a reconstituting of the human, and no broaching of the question what is and not livable. So, what is the injustice opposed by such work? I would put it in this way: to be called unreal and to have that call, as it were, institutionalized as it from the differential treatment, is to become the other against whom or against which the human is made. It is the inhuman, the beyond the human, the less than human, the border that secures the human in its ostensible reality. To be called a copy or to be called unreal is one way in which one can be oppressed, but consider that it is more fundamental than that. To be oppressed means that you already exist as a subject of some kind. You are there and the visible and oppressed other for the master subject, as a possible or potential subject. But to be unreal is something else again. To be oppressed, you must first become intelligible. To find that, you are fundamentally unintelligible. Indeed, that the laws of culture and language find you to be impossibility is to find that you have not yet achieved access to the human, to find yourself speaking only and always as if you were human, but with the sense that you are not, to find that your language is hollow, that not recognition is forthcoming because norms by which recognition takes place are not in your favor. We might think that the question of how and one does one's gender is a merely cultural question or an indulgence on the part of those who insist on exercising bourgeoisie freedom in excessive dimensions. To say, however, that gender is performative is not simply to insist on a right to produce a pleasurable and subversive spectacle, but to allegorize the spectacular and consequential ways in which reality is both reproduced and contested. This is a consequence of for how gender presentations are criminalized and pathologized, how subjects who cross genderist internment and imprisonment by violence against transgendered subjects is not recognized as violence, and this violence is sometimes inflicted by the very states that should be offering such subject protection from violence. What if new forms of gender are possible? How does this affect the ways that we live and concrete needs of human community? And how are we distinguish between forms of gender possibility that are valuable and those that are not? I would say that it is not a question merely of producing a new future for genders that do not yet exist. The genders I have in mind have been in existence for a long time, but they have not been admitted into the terms that govern reality. So it is a question of developing within laws, psychiatry, social, and literary theory a new legitimating lexicon for the gender complexity that we have been living for a long time because the norms governing reality have not admitted these forms to be real. We will of necessity call them new. What place does the thinking of the possible have within political theorizing? Is the problem that we have no norm to distinguish among kinds of possibility, or does that only appear to be a problem if we fail to comprehend possibility itself as a norm? Possibility is an aspiration, something we might hope we will be equitably distributed, something that might be socially secured, something that cannot be taken for granted, especially if it is apprehended phenomenologically. The point is not to prescribe new gender norms, as if one were under the obligation of supply a measure, gauge, or norm to be adjudication of competing gender presentations. The normative aspiration at work here has to do with the ability to live and breathe and move and would no doubt belong somewhere, in what is called a philosophy of freedom. I thought of a possible life is only an indulgence for those who already know themselves to be possible, for those who are still looking to become possible. Possibility is a necessity. It was Spinoza who claimed that every human being seeks to persist in his own being, and he made this principle of self-persistence the conatus into the basis of his ethics and indeed his politics. When Hegel made the claim that desire is always a desire for recognition, he was in a way extrapolating upon the Spinozistic point, telling effectively that there's persist in one's own being is only possible on the condition that we are engaged in receiving and offering recognition. If we are not recognizable, if there's no norms of recognition by which are not recognizable, then it is not possible to persist in one's own being. And we are not possible beings. We can't be foreclosed from possibility. We think of norms of recognition perhaps are residing already in a cultural world into which we are born, but the norms change, and with the change in these norms come changes in the and what does and does not count as recognizably human. And to twist the Hegelian argument in Foucauldian direction, norms of recognition function to produce and deproduce the notion of the human. This is made true in a specific way when we consider how international norms work in context of lesbian, gay, human rights, especially as they insist that certain kinds of violence are permissible, that certain lives are vulnerable and worthy of protection, that certain deaths are grievable and worthy of public recognition. Okay, let's stop here. In the last couple pages, Butler writes about the politics. For this reason, I want to point out what the relation of sociology and politics is. Both sciences depend on each other, and they are interrelated and interdependent. As we know, sociology investigates about the society, and it is a study of systems of social action, social groups, and social institutions. Political science, on the other side, is the science of state and government, which studies power, political processes, political systems, types of government, and international relations. On the one hand, sociology is depending on political science. There are several aspects in which you can see those. First of all, the state and government makes the law for the welfare of the society. Moreover, social institutions and social organizations are regulated by the state and government, and not to forget that the government can bring changes in the society with the help of law. But on the other hand, political science depends upon sociology as well. Some sociologists even see political science as a special branch of sociology. This goes back to the thought that forms of government, the nature of governmental organs, the laws, and the sphere of state activity are determined by the social processes. Also, the laws which are formed by the government are based on the social customs, tradition, and norms. In addition, political problems are mainly corrected with social aspects, which requires an essential knowledge about sociology. Well, let's go back to the reading. To say that the desire to persist in one's own being depends on norms of recognition is to say that the basis of one's autonomy, one's persistence, is an I through time depends fundamentally on the social norm that exceeds that I, that positions that I aesthetically outside itself in a world of complex and historically changing norms. In fact, of our lives, our very persistence depend upon such norms, or at least one of the possibility that we will be able to negotiate within them derive our agency from the field of their operation. In our very ability to persist, we are dependent on what it is outside of us, on the broader sociality, and this dependency is the basis of our endurance and survivability. When we assert our right, as we do and we must, we are not carving out a place for our autonomy. If by autonomy we mean a state of individuation, taken as self persisting prior to apart from any relations of dependency on the world of others. We do not negotiate with norms or which others subsequent or our coming into the world. We come into the world on the condition that the social world is already there, laying the groundwork for us. This implies that I cannot persist without norms of recognition. What support my persistence, the sense of possibility pertaining to me, must first be imagined from somewhere else before I can begin to imagine myself. My reflexivity is not only socially mediated but socially constituted. I cannot be who I am without drawing upon the sociality of norms that precede and exceed me. In this sense, I am outside myself from the outset and must be in order to survive and in order to enter into the realm of the possible. To assert sexual rights then takes on a specific meaning against this background. It means, for instance, that when we struggle for rights, we are not simply struggling for rights that attach to my person, but we are struggling to be convened as persons, and there is a difference between the former and the latter. If we are struggling for rights that attach or should attach to my personhood, then we assume that personhood is already constituted. But if we are struggling not only to be conceived as persons, but to create a social transformation of the very meaning of personhood, then the assertion of rights becomes a way of intervening into the social and politic process, which the human is articulated. International human rights is always in the process of subjecting the human to redefinition and renegotiation. It mobilizes the human in the service of rights. but also rewrites the human and rearticulates the human when it comes up against the cultural limits of its working conception of the human as it does and must. Lesbian and gay human rights take sexuality in some sense to be its issue. Sexuality is not simply an attribute one has or a disposition or pattern set of inclinations. It is a mode of being disposed toward others, including in the mode of fantasy, and sometimes only in the mode of fantasy. If we're outside of ourselves, as sexual beings given over from the start, crafted in part through primary relations of dependency and attachment, then it would seem that our being besides ourselves, outside ourselves, is there as a function of sexuality itself. Where sexuality is not this or that dimension of our existence, not the key or bedrock of our existence, but rather a coextensive with existence, as Merleau-Ponty once aptly suggested. I have tried here to argue that our very sense of personhood is linked to the desire for recognition, and that the desire places us outside ourselves, in the realm of social norms that we do not fully choose, but that provides the horizon and the resources for any sense of choice that we have. This means that the aesthetic character of our existence is essential to the possibility of persisting as human. In this sense, we can see how sexual rights brings together two related domains of aesthetic, two connected ways of being outside ourselves. As sexual, we are dependent on a world of others, vulnerable to need, violence, betrayal, compulsion, fantasy. We project desire and we have it projected onto us. To be part of our sexual minority means most emphatically that we are also dependent on the protection of public and private space, on legal sanctions that protect us from violence, on safeguards of various institutional kinds against unwanted aggression imposed upon us, and the violent actions they sometimes instigate. In this sense, our very lives and the persistence of our desire depend on there being norms of recognition that produce and sustain our viability as human. Thus, when we speak about sexual rights, we are not merely talking about um, rights that pertain to our individual desires, but to the norms on which our very individuality depends. That means that the discourse of rights avows our dependency, the mode of our being in the hands of others, a mode of being with and for others, without which we cannot be. I served for a few years on the board for the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, a group that is located in San Francisco. It is part of a broad international coalition of groups and individuals who struggle to establish both equality and justice for sexual minorities, including transgender and intersex individuals, as well as persons with HIV or AIDS. What astonished me time and again was how often the organization was asked to respond to immediate acts of violence against sexual minorities, especially when that violence was not redressed in any way by local police or government in various places in the globe. I had to reflect on what sort of anxiety is promoted by the public appearance of someone who is openly gay or presumed to be gay, someone whose gender does not conform to norms, someone whose sexuality defies public prohibitions, someone whose body does not conform with certain morphological ideals. What motivates those who are driven to kill someone, who being gay to threaten to kill someone for being intersex, or would be driven to kill because of the public appearance of someone who is transgendered, the desire to kill someone or killing someone for the conforming to the gender norm by which a person is supposed to live suggests that life itself requires a set of sheltering norms, and that to be outside it, to live outside it, is to court death. The person who threatens violence proceeds from the anxious and rigid belief that a sense of world and a sense of a self will be radically undermined if such a being, uncategorizable, is permitted to live within the social world. The negotiations through violence of that body is a vain and violent effort to restore order, to renew a social world on the basis of intelligible gender, and to refuse the challenge to rethink that world as something other than natural necessary. This is not far removed from the threat of death or the murder itself of transsexuals in various countries and of the gay men who read as feminine or gay women who read as masculine. These crimes are not always immediately recognized as criminal acts. Sometimes they are denounced by governments and international agencies. Sometimes they are not included as legible or real crimes against humanity by those very institutions. If we oppose this violence, then we oppose it in the name of what? What is the alternative to this violence, and for what transformation of the social world do I call? This violence emerges from a profound desire to keep the order of binary gender natural or necessary, to make of it a structure either natural or cultural, or both, that not human can oppose and still remain human. If a person opposes norms of binary gender, not just by having a critical point of view about them, but by incorporating norms critically, and that stylized opposition is legible, then it seems that violence emerges precisely as the demand to undo that legibility, to question its possibility, to render it unreal and impossible in the face of its appearance to the contrary. This is then no simple difference in points of view. To counter that embodied opposition by violence is to say effectively that this body is challenged to an accepted version of the world is and shall be unthinkable. The effort to enforce the boundaries of what will be regarded as real requires stalling what is contingent, frail, open to fundamental transformation in the gendered order of things. An ethical query emerges in the light of such of an analysis. How might we encounter the difference that calls our grids of intelligibility into question without trying to foreclose the challenge that the differences delivers? What might it mean to learn to live in the anxiety of the challenge, to feel the certainty of one's epistemological and ontological anchor go, but to be willing in the name of the human to allow the human to become something other than what it is traditionally assumed to be. This means that we must learn to live and to embrace the destruction of re-articulation of the human in the name of a more capricious and finally less violent world, not knowing in advance what precise form our humanness does and will take. It means we must be open to its permutations in the name of nonviolence. As Adriana Cavero points out, paraphrasing Arendt, the question we pose to the other is simply and unanswerable. Who are you? The violent response is the one that does not ask and does not seek to know. It wants to shore up what it knows, to expunge what threatens it with not knowing, what forces is it to reconsider the presupposition of its world, their contingency, their malleability. The nonviolent response lies with its unknowingness about the other in the face of the other, since sustaining the bond that the question opens is finally more valuable than knowing in advance what holds us in common, as if we already have all the resources we need to know what defines the human, what its future life might be. Let's stop here at the page. As Butler mentions lesbian and gay human rights, I want to point out here her influence on queer theories. The queer theories are a relatively new field of studies from around the 80s and follow and expand upon feminist theory by exploring gendered and sexualized practices that are constructed as divisions in cultures and by foregrounding those who do not neatly fit into conventional categories. It is not a single theory, it's a set of propositions which are related to gender and sexuality. Therefore, there doesn't exist any categorizing of people within their theories. There are several uses. First, it is used as a tool to examine power and power relations, especially the political nature of sex, gender, and sexuality. Besides that, it is used as a tool for critique the creation of the categories for sex, gender, and sexual identities. Another use is the re-examination of historical viewpoints. It is also used to build coalitions and activism. Therefore, the term queer was invented to unite those marked as sexual divisions or gender outlaws. Well, let's go back to the reading. That we cannot predict or control what permutations of the human might arise does not mean that we must value all possible permutations of the human. It does not mean that we cannot struggle for the realization of certain values, democratic and nonviolent, international and anti-racist. The point is only that to struggle for those values is precisely to avow that one's own position is not sufficient to elaborate the specific the spectrum of the human, that one must enter into a collective work in which one's own status as a subject must, for democratic reasons, become disoriented, exposed to what it does not know. The point is not to apply social norms to lift social instances in order to order and define them, as Foucault has criticized, nor is it to find justificatory mechanism for the grounding of social norms that are extra-social, even as they operate under the name of the social. There are times when both of these activities do and must take place. We level judgments against criminals for illegal acts and so subject them to a normalizing procedure. We consider our grounds for action in collective context and try to find modes of deliberation and reflection about which we can agree. But neither of these is we do with norms. Through resources to norms, the sphere of the humanly intelligible is circumscribed, and this circumscription is consequential for any ethics and any conception of social transformation. We might try to claim that we must first know the fundamentals of human in order to preserve and promote human life as we know it. But if the very categories of human have excluded those who should be described and sheltered within the terms, what if those who ought to belong to the human do not operate within the modes of reasoning and justifying validity claims that have been preferred by Western forms of rationalism? Have we ever yet known the human, and what might it take to approach the knowing? Should we be wary of knowing too soon, or of any final or definitive knowing? If we take the field of human for granted, then we fail to think critically and ethically about the consequential ways that the human is being produced, reproduced, and deproduced. This latter inquiry does not exhaust the field of ethics, but I cannot imagine a responsible ethics or theory of social transformation operating without it. The necessity of keeping our notion of human open to a future articulation is essential to the project of international human rights discourse and politics. We see this time and again when the very notion of the human is presupposed. The human is defined in advance in terms that are distinctly Western, very often American, and therefore partial and parochial. When we start with the human as a foundation, then the human at issue in human rights is already known, already defined, and yet the human is supposed to be the ground for a set of rights and obligations that are global in reach. How we move from the local to the international, conceived globally in such a way that it does not recirculate the presumption that all humans belong to established nation states, is a major question for international politics, but it takes a specific form for international lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and intersex struggles, as well as for feminism. An anti imperialist or minimally non imperialist conception of international human rights must call into question what it meant by the human and learn from the various ways and means by which it is defined across cultural venues. This means the local conception of what is human, or indeed of what the basic condition and needs of human life are, must be subjected to reinterpretation, since there are historical and cultural circumstances in which the human is defined differently. Its basic needs and basic entitlements are made known through various media, through various kinds of practices, spoken and performed. A reductive relativism would say that we cannot speak of the human for international human rights, since there are only and always local and provisional understandings of these terms, and that the generalization themselves do violence to the specificity of their meanings in question. This is not my view. I'm not ready to rest there. Indeed, I think we are compelled to speak of the human and of the international, and to find out in particular how human rights do and do not work. For example, in favor of women, of what women are and what they are not. But to speak in this way and to call for social transformations in the name of women, we must also be part of a critical democratic project. Moreover, the category of women has been used differently in and with exclusionary aims, and not all women have been included within its terms. Women have been fully incorporated into the human. Both categories are still in process, underway, unfulfilled, thus we do not yet know and cannot ever definitely know in what the human finally consists. This means that we must follow a double path in politics. We must use this language to assert an entitlement to conditions in life in ways that affirm the constitutive role of sexuality and gender in political life. And we must also subject our very categories to critical um, scrutiny. We must find out the limits of their inclusivity and translatability, their presumptions. They include the ways in which they must be expanded, destroyed, or reworked both to encompass and open up what it is to be human and gendered. When the United Nations conference in Beijing met a few years ago, there was a discourse on women's human rights. Or when we hear of the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, which strikes many people as a paradox. Women's human rights, lesbian and gay human rights, but think about what the coping actually does. It performs the human as a consequent a category that has in the past and continues in the present. A defined that variable and restricted population which may or may not include lesbians and gays, may or may not include women, which has several racial and ethnic differentials at work in its operation. It says such groups have their own set of human rights, and that human may mean when we think about the humanness of women is perhaps different from what has meant when it says function as presumptively male. It also says that these terms are defined variably in relation to one another, and we could certainly make a similar agreement about race. Which population have qualified as the human and which have not? What is the history of this category? Where are we in history at this time? So, before we finish this chapter, I want to stop here. Butler picks up the category of woman, which is a part of the feminist theory, and I want to talk about that. It involves around the question what makes the feminist theory feminist, but the answer on this question is not anymore discrimination by the virtue of there being a woman. It turned towards that the category woman is a fiction which is created through the meta theoretical assumption. But even though the category is still vital because it relates to something real, with making the category of woman a subject of discussion, Butler wanted to express that we should rethink the category of woman in order to include new possibilities, such as trans women. She has the aim to expand the category to include, for example, like I said, trans women or other people. But in general, it shows us that social reality can and does change. One more last time, let's go back to the text. I would suggest that in the last process we can only re-articulate or re-signify the basic categories of ontology, of being human, of being gendered, of being recognizably sexual, to the extent that we submit ourselves to a process of cultural translation. The point is not to assimilate foreign or unfamiliar notions of gender or humanness into our own, as if it is simply of a matter of incorporation aligness into an established lexicon. Cultural translation is also a process of yielding our most fundamental categories, that is, seeing how and why they break up, require resignification when they encounter the limits of an available episteme, what is unknown or not yet known. It is crucial to recognize that the notion of the human will only be built over time and by the process of cultural translation. Word is not a translation between two languages that stay close, distinct, and unified. But rather, translation will compel each language to change in order to apprehend the other. And this apprehension at the limit of what is familiar, parochial, and already known will be the occasion for both an ethical and a social transformation, and will constitute a loss of disorientation, but on in which the human stands of a chance of coming into being anew. When we ask what makes a life livable, we are asking about certain normative conditions that must be fulfilled for life to become life. And so there are at least two senses of life. The one of the refers to the minimum biological form of living, and another that intervenes at the start, which establishes minimum conditions for a livable life with regard to human life. And this does not imply that we can disregard their merely living in favor of a livable life, but that we must ask, as we ask about gender violence, what humans require in order to maintain and reproduce the condition of their own livability, and what are our politics such that we are, in whatever way is possible, both conceptualizing and possibility of the livable life and arranging for its institutional support. There will always be disagreement about what it means, and those who claim that a single political direction is necessitated by virtue of this commitment will be mistaken. But this is only because to live is to live a life politically in relation to power, in relation to others, in the act of assuming responsibility for a collective future. To assume responsibility for a future, however, is not to know its direction fully in advance, since the future, especially the future with and for others, requires a certain openness and unknowingness. It implies becoming part of a process, that outcomes of which no one subject can surely predict. It also implies that a certain agonism and contestation over the course of direction will and must be in play. Contestation must be in play for politics and become democratic. Democracy does not speak in unions. Its tunes are dissonant and necessarily so. It is not a predictable process. It must be undergone, like a passion must be undergone. It may also be that life itself becomes foreclosed when the right way is decided in advance, when we impose what is right for everyone and without finding a way to enter into community and to discover there the right in the midas of cultural translation. It may be that what is right and what is good consists in staying open to the attention that beset the most fundamental categories we require in knowing unknowingness. At the core of what we know and what we need, and in recognizing the sign of life in what we undergo without certainty about what will come. Now we finished reading, and I want to add one last comment. When Butler speaks about to compel each language to change in order to apprehend the other for a cultural translation, then the first thing what comes to my mind are the personal gender pronouns, which are getting more used over the last couple of years, especially online and on social media. Has the non-binary way been accepted, where people now listing pronouns in their bio? The use of the pronouns they, them as a gender neutral or gender inclusive pronoun provides an identity for a singular person who does not identify as he, him, or she, her. Moreover, this leaves room for other gender identities, and it's a linguistic attempt to create greater equality. In the end of the chapter, I would say this shows that Butler's aim to create an open space for more ways of thinking about reality, it is working. And I think the reality will be different in the future. Thank you very much for listening. And here are my resources. And I hope you could enjoy the podcast.